preparing to come to church, make it to the worship service. We have worship service here at RCC in the physical and virtually at 11 o'clock. Pastor Cates, I believe, will be bringing the word today, and we'd love to see you here in just a little while. But you may be watching this later on, and we're just grateful that you tune in and watch the recording of this. So this morning we're going to continue talking about the parables of Jesus. We're going to talk about forgiveness. We're going to continue in Matthew chapter 18, I believe, verses 21 through 30, 35. The parable of the unforgiving debtor. The Bible said that Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? Should it be 7 times?" Jesus said, "No, not just 7 times," Jesus replied. He said, "but 70 times 7. Now you can do the math. 70 times 7 is 490 times of this particular sin. Therefore, he continues on his parable of the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with the servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors had brought in who had owed him millions of dollars. Now, the New Living Translation really puts it in perspective. It's millions of dollars. King James talks about talents and weight, and we'll talk about that if you read the King James Version. But notice that it's this first one's millions of dollars. He couldn't pay it, so his master ordered that he be sold along with his wife and his children and everything that he owned to pay the debt. But the man fell down before his master, and he begged him, "Please be patient with me, and I will pay it." Then his master was filled with pity for him, and he released him, and he forgave his debt. So notice that he forgave it, even though it was millions here, the New Living Translation says. But when the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him just a few $1,000s. He grabbed him by the throat, and he demanded instant payment. His fellow servant fell down before him, and he begged for a little more time. "Be patient with me, and I'll pay it," he pleaded. Basically the same plea that the other guy had made to the king. But verse 30 says, but his creditor wouldn't wait. He had the man arrested. He put him in prison until the debt could be paid in full. Verse 31, when some of the other servants saw, they were very upset. They went to the king, and they told him everything that had happened. Then the king called in the man that he had forgiven and said, "You evil servant, I forgave you of that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you?" Then the angry king, notice the angry king, sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had paid his entire debt. That's what my heavenly Father, this is Jesus. Jesus says, that's what my heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart. Wow. So as we look at this parable, Jesus is very blunt. He's very plain. This is one parable that we notice there were parables in chapter 18 that are very, we might call them cryptic. They take much discernment. You have to be very spiritually minded. You have to look into one even such that Jesus had to explain the one about the sower, as we have talked about earlier weeks ago. He had to just go ahead and explain it to the disciples and explain that his parables to the people were much times for the spiritually minded. They could just not sit there and be carnally minded and discern the meaning of those parables. They had to have a spiritual side to them. They had the desire to want to get closer to Jesus so that they could understand them. But in this parable, we see that it's very plainly spoken. And maybe it's very plainly spoken. We start trying to understand all these parables of why some are harder than others to understand, is that he's speaking to Peter. He's speaking directly to Peter, so it's not very encrypted. It's pretty plainly spoken. And we shouldn't dig very deep trying to find just some kind of great epiphany of a meaning here. It's really plain. We need to forgive. We need to forgive. This particular parable, we see it continues to compare the kingdom of heaven to a king who is intent on settling his debts. The king is intent on getting all those that owe him took care of. It's not really that difficult to translate, especially when we put it in like a New Living Translation or something like that. God plays a banker here. He maybe even a parent. He even looks like a loan shark at some point in time here. He works to convey the same harsh irony of the story in which a king forgives much, but the one whom much is given forgives nothing. The parable is in no way very difficult to understand or difficult to comprehend. Unlike the parable of the lost sheep that we talked about last week, that's really counterintuitive. It just doesn't sometimes make sense. You leave the 99, you go for the one. You leave them. Do you leave them? You know, we talked about that. You could, if you've not watched that, you can go back and watch that on YouTube. Probably it's archived in Facebook also, and you can talk about that. Those things that we think about when we talk about it. It's a little counterintuitive when we talk about that lost sheep. The parable of the sower we talked about just a minute ago. He even gives a full explanation in the gospel itself of what the meaning of the sower is, or the treasure hidden in the field. That's he gives interpretation of that. But there's really two basic thoughts that are real easy to understand in this parable here. Their thoughts about forgiveness in conversation with the parable of the unforgiven servant. First, forgiveness. Forgiveness in this parable is both extravagant. That is probably a proper word. Forgiveness is extravagant in this parable, and it's a very precious thing. When we look at an equation or the mathematics of the respective debts of these two people, we see in the King James Version it talks about talents, and talents is a measure of weight. It's close to 130 pounds. Basically, the one that the New Living Translation says that owes millions, in perspective of the New King James or the King James Version, the weight that he owed in silver would roughly equate to about 15 years worth of wages. The servant that owed the king the greatest amount had about 15 years worth of wages for the typical worker that he owed. The king in the parable is owed in the King James, I believe, 10,000 talents in this case. Now, if he's owed 10,000 talents, that's about 150,000 years worth of income, which works out to be about 3,000 financial life sentences. Here's the point. It's a great debt that servant owes. It is an astronomical debt that he owes, to the point that it's a debt that he can never, ever repay the king. But the king, what does he do? He forgives him. Now, the other servant that owes the debt to the individual that's been forgiven, remember the debt that he can never repay, that servant's forgiven, and that servant has a servant underneath him that has a debt to him that is very minimum compared to the debt. The debt that even the New Living Translation says is about a couple $1,000. It's a debt in perspective that could be repaid to the servant. Essentially, when it's compared, it's just a very relative debt that wouldn't be easy to repay, but is very possible to repay. If we look at it with backwards thinking, the unforgiving servant in this equation, in reverse replied, is his life in the original, the one that cannot repay his debt, his life is more valuable. The king says, your life is more valuable than the debt that you owe me. He could never repay it. But likewise, that same servant goes and he jails the one that has a small debt. Forgiveness, as laid out in this parable, is extravagant and it's extreme. The king would never got repaid his debt, but yet he showed extreme and extravagant forgiveness. And much more precious by far than the wages of the sin that the servant had committed. Here's the thing. The servant to the king, the main servant, the one that owed the most, could never repay the king. His life was over. His debt was too far great. There was no way the king could have had him killed because he would never retrieved his money. He would have never retrieved the debt. His family, not only is the servant's life over, but generations of his family would have been indebted to the king. So basically, all the lineage of that person would have been affected by that servant's debt. But the king said, I'm going to forgive you. I'm going to let you live. I'm going to let you operate. And by far, I'm going to bless your debt because you petitioned with me. You asked me. You cared enough. You cried out to me. And I'm going to forgive it. Your life is what the king said. Your life and your family and all your lineage is more precious to me than this debt that you owe me. But yet we see that the second thing that this parable teaches us is that forgiveness has a reciprocation. It's reciprocal. When forgiveness is given, it also should be given away also. We receive forgiveness, so we should give forgiveness. We give forgiveness, and we receive forgiveness. So we see that forgiveness in the Gospel of Matthew is not only relational, but it's reciprocal and it's reliant. When teaching his disciples to pray, Jesus said this, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. The fifth petition of the Lord's Prayer is echoed in this lesson of the parable about the kingdom. It reflects back in reverse. We ought to forgive as the King has forgiven us, Jesus says. In answering the disciples in the request to help them pray, Jesus teaches them that forgiveness, both giving and receiving of it, is reciprocal. One cannot have it without doing it. You can't have forgiveness if you're not ever going to forgive. Yeah, that's what's unkind. If you have no forgiveness in you for others, how can you ever be able to receive forgiveness? Is what Jesus is teaching. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses, Matthew 6:14 and 15 says. In answering Peter's request for help in understanding how far, in this context, in this parable, how far that forgiveness must go, or how far it needs to be taken, Jesus teaches that God's forgiveness surpasses both our deserving and our comprehension of it. Did you hear me this morning? God's forgiveness surpasses our deserving of it and our comprehension of it. We who have first been forgiven must therefore and thereupon forgive those who have wronged us, that really have wronged us much more lightly than we've wronged the king. And in this parable, that's what that illustrates. The point of the parable is clear. It demands both in the context of the Gospel of Matthew and its application to our congregations that today it's very urgent. It's very urgent. Forgiveness lies at the heart of our faith in God and our love for one another. Forgiveness which we receive from God our King in the person of Jesus Christ is what our King expects from his subjects in their dealings with others. Notice the king expected the one that he received that he forgave the great debt of to reciprocate that to his servants, to reflect what the king had forgave him, that he needs to continue to reflect it to those also that he has dealing with from day to day. Forgive us of our debts as we also forgive our debtors. As a prayer, this puts the emphasis on what we will receive in turn for the forgiveness that we offer. Forgive your brother or your sister from your heart. The parable turns the tables, teaching us that we have been forgiven, we have been first forgiven, and encouraging us to forgive others in turn. Taken together, this is a composite picture of the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom that we should be practicing, both of which are driven by forgiveness. So today's lesson, all about forgiveness. We've got to be able to forgive. If you're not forgiving, you're just really hurting yourself in all aspects. And we've got a parable here that Jesus teaches that the king's forgiven you and expects you to forgive. He's blessed you and he expects you to bless. So let's remember that this morning. We've got to find forgiveness, not only for ourselves selfishly with the king, but we've got to forgive those others that are in our life that have wronged us, that owe us a debt, that have did things. And how many times, Peter said, How many times? Should I just do it 7 times? No, Jesus said 7 times 70, 490 times. Now, I know you're not counting, and I'm not counting 490 times. What it really means for us is that's a whole lot of forgiveness that we've got to give, and the King wants us. It's not up to us. You say, well, I don't want to forgive that much. Well, then what did the King do to the servant that didn't forgive? Jesus was pretty plain what was going to happen. It even seems like a sense like the servant didn't realize what he really had been given. He thought it was just a debt removed. No, it was his life that he had been given. Jesus said very plainly, the angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he paid the entire debt. We just told you in perspective, he would never be able to pay the entire